Welcome to Emphasis Added, a podcast brought to you by the Houston Law Review about legal issues, prominent lawyers, and the study and practice of law. I'm Harrison Little.
And I'm Jake Guarino, and we are your hosts for Season 5. Thank you for joining us. Professor Peter Salib is an assistant professor of law at the University of Houston Law Center and a member of the associate faculty at the Hobby School of Public Affairs. He is known as an expert in the law of artificial intelligence, or as it is known as AI, and he serves as a law and policy advisor to the Center for AI Safety in San Francisco, as well as a co-director of the Center for Law and AI Risk at the University of Alabama School of Law.
His research applies substantive constitutional doctrine along with economic analysis to questions of AI governance. He's previously written about how machine learning techniques can be used to solve difficult problems in constitutional policy. Professor Salib's current research focuses on how law can help mitigate catastrophic risks from increasingly sophisticated AI technology. Professor Salib, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, your recent article analyzes the relationship between artificial intelligence and the First Amendment, the analysis being rooted in the notion that while AI can provide a wealth of benefits and advantages, it also poses numerous risks and dangers that must be accounted for. These problems necessitate safety guidelines that mitigate potentially catastrophic events caused by rogue AI, which leads us to ponder the best way to regulate AI capabilities.
So today we intend to explore the First Amendment concerns with regulating AI. However, before we do that, would you mind briefly illustrating some of the problems that artificial intelligence poses so we can better understand the need to regulate it?
Yeah, of course. There are a bunch of potential problems, challenges with AI systems as they become more capable. Some of them are actually quite well known, quite well discussed in the literature, and I think are dangers even of what you might think of as much less capable AI systems. So, for example, there's a large debate in the law review literature on algorithmic discrimination and bias. And algorithmic discrimination is a problem with all kinds of machine learning systems, even like really very narrow ones. For example, systems that diagnose moles as potentially cancerous or not might work better or worse on people with different skin tones, depending on the distribution of skin tones in the training data. So those are important challenges, but they're not really the ones I'm thinking about in this paper. I'm thinking about the kinds of dangers that emerge as AI systems become much more capable, much more general, and then over time, what you might think of as much more agentic. So the difference between, for example, the cancer risk diagnosing algorithm and something like GPT-4 is a difference along all three of those dimensions. So GPT-4 is much more general than a system like that. That is, it doesn't just output one thing, cancer, not cancer. It can output like poems or code or solve math problems or just have a nice conversation with you. It can operate across many kinds of contexts. That's generality. Capability is like, how good is it at stuff? AI systems are becoming increasingly more capable even as they become more general. So you could ask a question like, how good is an AI system at solving like a general knowledge test like the SAT or the LSAT or something? And for example, GPT-4 is much better than GPT-3 was. I think GPT-4's median LSAT score, when you test a bunch of times, is like 163 or something, which is pretty good. And then more agent-like is just the question of how much can these general and capable systems plan and execute strategies to pursue goals over time. Current large language models, for example, aren't super agent-like because they can't remember anything. But for example, if you ask GPT-4 to make you a plan for a vacation, it can do that in a kind of step-by-step way. It can help you first decide where you'd like to go, and then what kind of a hotel you'd like to stay in, and then what kind of activity we'd like to do, and it can like make those later decisions based on the stuff that happened before. So these are systems that are advancing along this agency dimension too. And so the paper argues that as systems become increasingly agentic, increasingly capable and increasingly general, they're going to pose new kinds of larger scale dangers. the basic thing to understand about this is like general, capable, and agentic systems will begin by helping people do whatever people want to do much more effectively. Many of the things people want to do are good, but some of the things people want to do are bad. So large language models, for example, are already capable of helping to coach non-specialists through the process of doing something like creating an explosive or a poison, or even through the steps they might take if they wanted to obtain a live sample of something like the Spanish flu strain. So if you are a person intent on causing wide-scale harm, these large language models are already at a stage where they are able to help you in a kind of step-by-step way. Now, these models are not like superhuman yet. It's not like they can just go do the thing for you. But I think that the evidence we have of models' ability at helping people plan these kinds of chemical or biological attacks, at cyber attacks. Large language models are actually quite good at coding, and especially models like Claude and probably newer models like Gemini that have long context windows can actually do quite a lot of like hacking autonomously. You can just show them a website and say, find the vulnerabilities in this website and exploit them. They can do that autonomously to a surprising degree. So cyber risk seems like an important set of risks emerging as these models get more capable. And then, of course, there's an intense market demand to make these models efficacious like in the real world, not just be able to make text and do stuff in computers, but to like pilot robots. So you can think of self-driving cars, which are run by neural networks, but companies like DeepMind and the other big AI labs are working at putting large language models in control of robots that go and do stuff in the real world. So you ask them to go perform a task for you, and they break it down into subparts. They form a strategy. They're taking in sensor data from cameras. The newest generation of large language models are all multimodal, which means they can understand text, but they can also understand video and images. And so I think in a world like that, you can imagine a lot of uses of AI that might be intentionally malicious. And then, of course, as these systems become more and more capable in general in the real world, I think we'll see a trend where more and more stuff is just handed off to them to do autonomously. And at that stage, we should ask not only about whether people will misuse systems intentionally, but about whether those systems, as they pursue things autonomously without human oversight, maybe not easily amenable to human oversight, whether those systems may sometimes inadvertently be set to pursuing goals that would be incompatible with human flourishing. A simple example is like, suppose you are at a stage where GPT-7 can like run your business or something like that, and you say, go make me as much money as possible. Well, one thing that humans do when they want to make as much money as possible is they like steal things, or they sabotage their competitors, or they hack their competitors' systems so they shut down. And unless we're very careful, those bad, harmful actions will be useful for AIs pursuing the goals we set for them in the same ways that they're useful for the humans who do these kinds of things when humans are in charge. So those are the kinds of risks I'm thinking about in this paper.
And so I suppose as AI becomes more advanced and poses these types of risks, the need to regulate becomes increasingly pronounced. And then one of the barriers to passing regulations would be the First Amendment, which is what you've chosen to focus on in your recent paper. So in your paper, you propose that AI outputs are not protected speech, and you examine the question through two different frameworks that you contend yield the same result. You argue that AI outputs are not speech at all, and that even if one concedes that they are speech, the speech does not belong to anyone with First Amendment rights. So let's begin with the first framework, where you argue that AI outputs aren't speech at all. Why shouldn't AI outputs be considered the speech of the AI's creator?
So this is a great question. Before I answer it, this is a great law professor thing to do. Let me answer a different question, but one that I think is useful to frame the question. So we could ask first, like, why should the First Amendment come into it? Like, why is it even plausible that the First Amendment should come into this debate? I mean, one thing to say is that the First Amendment seems to come into everything now. There's a a lot of legal scholarship on what's been called the Lochnerization of the First Amendment, this idea that the First Amendment can be an impediment to regulation of all kinds. But I think there's actually a much more like facially plausible reason to think that the First Amendment will matter to AI safety regulations. Because one thing you might think that a set of AI safety regulations should do is it should ask the question, when OpenAI is ready to release GPT-5 or GPT-6 or some other kind of highly general and capable AI model, you might think that regulation should force someone to go find out, maybe engineers at OpenAI, maybe a regulator, to find out whether GPT-5 can be induced to attempt to help you make VX gas or something like that. When you ask the model, is there a way to get it to try and help you to do that? And you might think that one thing that would be good is that if the answer is yes, if a certain model is very happy to help its users try to plan, say, a terrorist attack, that there should be some regulatory response. Maybe the model can't be released until that propensity to help is eradicated from it. Maybe the company that wants to release the model faces some kind of financial penalty. Some regulatory response when the model outputs this help you do a terrorist attack kind of text. And that looks kind of on its face like what we would call in many other contexts a regulation of speech. Like when someone giving a speech says something like, the United States government must be overthrown by force, and the police come and put that person in jail, we ask a lot of First Amendment questions about that. And so I think that AI safety regulation is going to have elements of that form for various technical reasons we don't need to talk about in this podcast. It's actually really hard to keep an advanced AI system from saying that kind of stuff in advance. The only way to know whether it's going to say it is to make the model and then try and get it to say it. And then maybe you can turn around and fix it, although that's also a hard technical problem. So just as a matter of practicality, there are going to have to be rules that operate, that like kick into action when an LLM or some sort of similar kind of capable AI, we'll put in scare quotes, says some stuff. And that seems like it should, on its face, raise some First Amendment questions. So the question is like, what are these outputs? Like when GPT-5 produces some text that maybe is useful for you in executing a terrorist attack, like what are those outputs under the First Amendment? Are they speech? Are they protected speech? If yes, protected speech, I think there are reasons to think that very stringent First Amendment tests are going to apply, maybe something like strict scrutiny, or maybe something like the Brandenburg test, which is the one that applies when the speech giver says the U.S. government must be overthrown by force. So if protected speech, I think the hurdles to regulation are higher. It doesn't mean regulation will be impossible, but it means, for example, the regulation would probably have to be quite well tailored. Meaning that, I don't know, maybe you're not allowed to forbid the release of GPT-5 just because it will help you make cyanide. Maybe we say, cyanide's not a dangerous enough poison, only if it's VX gas or something like that. Whereas regulators might really like to be able to do something if they discover a model will help you make cyanide, because they might worry that it'll also help you make VX gas. They just haven't figured out how to make the model do that yet.
Seems like a valid concern.
Yeah. So this is why First Amendment worry. And so we can ask, like, are these outputs speech? Are they somebody's speech? There are like some short papers by a handful of other First Amendment scholars raising some theories about why these outputs might be speech. And there are a couple theories of like whose speech they might be. The first one you raise is this idea that when someone makes a large language model, a similar AI, that then the outputs of that model are that person's speech. Okay, so now I can answer the question you actually asked me. Oh, please do cut in. I'm you guys are used to this. You interview law professors, so we'll go on and on until you stop us. So please stop me if you want to. Okay, so why might you think that what comes out of GPT-5 is the speech of the engineer who made GPT-5? Well, one reason is that that's true of a lot of software. So, for example, suppose you're a video game designer and you're making a game, let's say, about sort of totalitarian government. There's a game, Papers, Please, a real video game where the player plays as like a border agent, and you have to process transit papers out of your totalitarian state, and you're presented with moral dilemmas over the course of the game. Well, like, somebody wrote the code for that game, and the person who did that had a message to communicate. It's the same kind of message you communicate when you write, say, a novel. Like, software can clearly be communicative in this way. Many kinds of software are, but video games are a nice example. And I think we think that the outputs of the software that constitutes Papers, Please are the speech of the engineer or team of engineers who wrote Papers, Please.
Because of the underlying message, correct?
Yeah, because when those engineers sat down, they said, what kind of a game are we going to make? And someone said, it's a game about totalitarian governance. And they said, well, what do we want to say about that? And then somebody else said, well, we want to show how like an ordinary person might get caught up in this system, might in some way feel they had to be complicit in the system because of the stakes to themselves and their family, and so on and so on. They had like a plan for what they wanted to say. They wrote some code that would then produce outputs that would instantiate that message. Like, the outputs reflect the thing the creator set out to say. And that's true of a lot of software. And so you might be tempted to think that it's true of large language models. Because after all, like, the stuff they put out has content, maybe has a message, we'll put in scare quotes for now, in the same way that it seems like the output of the video game code, the video game itself, has content. But I think the big difference between something like Papers, Please and something like a large language model is the people who made Papers, Please set out to write some code whose outputs would communicate something in particular, right? Like, it's about totalitarian governance. It has this particular viewpoint on that it's bad, but also that the people who are caught up in it are not all necessarily evil, and so on and so on. And they worked hard to make sure that the outputs of their software would reflect all those things that they wanted to say.
Kind of like a Twitter bot, right?
Yeah, so TwitterBot's like a super easy example. If you program a Twitter bot that just goes on Twitter and says, the Houston Law Review is the best law review, and it just posts that in every thread.
I mean, it's true, right?
It's true, so you'd want to say it. Then you're quite sure that bot is going to produce outputs that reflect your message. It says exactly what you tell it to say, like probably verbatim, maybe you put some randomness in, but really quite close. The people who set out to make large language models and similar kind of highly general, highly capable AI systems, they don't set out to make software whose outputs say something in particular. They set out to make software whose outputs can say essentially everything, right? Like, the whole point of ChatGPT is that you can talk about it or talk with it about like anything. You can ask it a math question. You can ask it what its favorite Beatles song is. You can ask it how to make spaghetti bolognese. It can tell you about all those things.
Could it come on a podcast?
It could. Well, so I think there's an episode of a podcast called Conversations with Tyler, cool. Which features ChatGPT as interlocutor. So you should listen to it and decide if you'd like to have ChatGPT as a guest.
Absolutely.
So it sounds like one reason why AI is different is because of its sheer expansiveness. So what would you say to somebody who would argue that, let's say the creator of an AI narrows the number of sources from which the AI can pull? Would you say that reflects, to some extent, the judgment of the creator about which sources are reputable, and that could somehow be interpreted as speech?
So it clearly reflects a judgment of the creator about which sources are reputable, but I don't think that makes the outputs of the system that the creator then creates speech. So you could ask two different kinds of questions. You could ask one question that's something like, is any of the stuff you do as you make a large language model expressive? And the answer to that is like probably. It's maybe a complicated question. Like, is curating the huge amount of training data that you need to train a model, is that an expressive act, or is that just you like doing your job? You could ask the same stuff about like people who work on the GM assembly line. Is like screwing in the engine mounts, like, is that expressive? I don't know. It depends on what you think about engine mounts, I guess.
That makes me think back to O'Brien, the quote that the Supreme Court refused to accept that there is simply a limitless variety of speech.
Exactly. And so there may be hard questions. So, is an expressive act to say we're not going to have 4chan as part of the training data? 4chan is like it's a website on which there's a lot of unsavory content, we'll say. If someone decides we're not going to have 4chan as part of the training data of GPT-4, is that expressive? Or is it just trying to make a chatbot that works well? It's hard to say. But either way, I don't think it changes the answer to the question, is the stuff that GPT-4 then outputs your speech? I think the answer to that question is still no. Because the thing you are building is still not a thing that is designed and intended to communicate some set of like thoughts and ideas that you had in advance. Like the whole point of making GPT-4 is that it can say all the stuff that the engineers never thought about in advance, right? It would not be a very good large language model. It may not even be a large language model like that you could build in principle that would only say stuff that engineers at OpenAI like knew and would endorse. And it's not in any sense, or at any rate, what they want to build, right? Like the fact that I give an example. The engineers at OpenAI probably don't know anything about the mating habits of the western corn rootworm. That's a real insect. Nevertheless, they'd be perfectly happy to have GPT-4 know stuff about that. And if someone needs to know about the mating habits of the western corn rootworm, they would like GPT-4 to be able to help them with that. So they want a system that will say innumerable things that they've never thought of at all, and in that sense are not a message they're trying to convey. They'd also like a system that can say innumerable things with which they would just disagree, right? Some of those disagreements can be totally trivial, right? So I don't know, you ask GPT-4, which is your favorite beetle? Like the engineers want it to have an answer, and it's much more important to them that it have an answer than that the answer be Paul, which let's say is the best beetle according to the engineers at OpenAI. They're perfectly happy if GPT-4 says Ringo, for example, and there's like millions and millions and millions of questions like that. You can ask GPT-4, it will tell you an answer, and not only might be an answer that the engineers at OpenAI wouldn't agree with or wouldn't have thought of in advance, is not a message they've decided to communicate, but they might even say, no, I don't think that, right? And nevertheless, that's a success in their eyes. Like, that's the thing they want, a large language model.
To spit out an answer when you ask it?
Yeah, to be able to answer, like, essentially all the questions, right? As many of the questions as possible.
So if AI's outputs are not the creator's speech, could you also deem it the speech of the user instead?
Yeah, so this is like another one of the kind of leading theories. So maybe the outputs of GPT-4 or Claude or Gemini are not the speech of the engineers who made it, but are the speech of the person who's sitting there prompting it. And I think the answer there is basically the same and for the same reasons, right? So when I ask GPT-4, what's your favorite beetle? Well, it has an answer, and the answer may not be Paul, which is the correct answer. But if GPT-4 says Ringo, I don't think it's natural to say, and also Peter Salib said Ringo, right? Similarly, I don't know, I might ask GPT-4 to write a poem for me. And suppose I actually say a lot about what kind of poem I'd like, right? So I say, I have an example in the paper, a poem about fettuccine Alfredo. So I've directed it some. Say I direct it even more. I say, make the poem beautiful, make it elegant, make it express the deep experience of consuming the delicious dish, fettuccine alfredo. And then GPT-4 will write something, but that something probably isn't my speech in any meaningful way. And here's two ways you can tell that. One is I might say, make it beautiful, make it express the experience of eating fettuccine alfredo. Yeah, right. It's an important experience, right? I want to communicate that essence of the experience. And suppose it outputs the poem that in fact it did, and I put it in the paper that says something about, I wish I had memorized. It's a haiku. It's short. I should memorize it.
We'd love to see it.
Well, you can post it on the website with the show. It says something about like noodles and cream intertwining, savor Zen's delight. And look, maybe that's what it's like for me to eat fettuccine alfredo. But maybe I don't find it a Zen experience at all. Maybe I find it like a hyper intense experience, right? Like I'm not Zen, I'm not relaxed. I am amped up when I eat fettuccine alfredo, right? I could just disagree. Mm-hmm. Like I could just say, no, actually that's not what I think at all about what it's like. It also might write something that I agree with, but it would be kind of a coincidence, right? The other thing about that poem is it suggests that you make fettuccine alfredo with cream. And I know that's false, right? I'm a sophisticated home chef. I know that you make fettuccine alfredo with only 3 ingredients: fettuccine, cheese, and butter.
Should have trained it on better data.
Right? But it would be super weird to say, yeah, Salib made a mistake. Peter Salib wrote a poem saying that fettuccine is made with cream, and that's his mistake. I think it's much more natural for us to say that GPT-4 made a mistake, like that the poem is GPT-4's speech. Now, look, maybe I really like the poem. Maybe I then like copy paste it onto my Twitter. I say, cream and noodles flow together, savor Zen's delight or something. Well, now, of course, it's my speech, right? But that's not really the question the paper is trying to ask. Like, just like any speech, anyone can adopt it for themselves, right? I could hear someone, chanting in the street, Black Lives Matter. That's not my speech, but I might think it's a good message, and then I might start chanting it too. And so in a context like that, the stuff GPT-4 says might become my speech by adoption. But as it like rolls off the presses, as it like falls out of the model weights, I think it's pretty hard to say that it's my speech. And I think that's true even as you start to make your prompts pretty detailed for the reasons I said before. Like maybe you say, don't put the cream thing in there, right? It can still then produce a poem that you would just say, that's not the kind of poem I would write. I don't actually think it's beautiful. I don't actually think it captures the experience of eating fettuccine alfredo. So yeah, I think fundamentally that's why my view is that the outputs of the models, at least as they come off the press, are not the user's speech. Now you could imagine examples where they seem like the user's speech. So for example, if I say, copy the following verbatim, and then I paste in something I've written, maybe what comes out we would still say is my speech. I mean, there's a question like, who am I speaking to? Maybe if like, I don't know, I'm doing it in a lecture and a bunch of people can see it, and now I've communicated a message to the people I'm lecturing to. But that's kind of a weird use case. The more normal use case that's close to that would be one where I've written a short essay and I copy paste it into a language model and I say, well, correct all the grammar mistakes in this essay. And so it spits out a new version that's my speech, but with the grammar mistakes corrected. I think there it's natural to say that those outputs are my speech, but I think there it's less natural to say that a regulation of those outputs would be a regulation directly of my speech. I think it's much more natural then to say that the regulation would be of like a tool I might use, I might wish to use to speak. And we usually call those like time, place, and manner or incidental restrictions in First Amendment world. So there we think that what's being regulated is not really the speech itself, but the tool or the medium through which the speech is transmitted or built.
And so, moving to the second framework, where you argue that AI outputs might be speech, let's just say we grant that, but they don't belong to anyone with First Amendment rights. So if we treat an AI as its own speaker, what are some of the difficulties in maintaining that it is entitled to First Amendment rights?
Yeah, so this is I think the other major framework for thinking about AI outputs as speech. There's at least one paper by Norton and Massaro arguing that we should think of, this is actually a paper that came out before large language models sort of hit the scene. So in this sense, it's quite a prescient paper, very ahead of its time, arguing that a sufficiently sophisticated AI system, I think the line in the paper goes something like, where we would say the outputs are, quote, theirs, not ours, or it's not ours. That a system like that, we maybe should think of as a speaker, and maybe we should think of it as a protected speaker. And I think all the stuff I said before about why AI outputs aren't creator speech or user's speech makes it seem like the outputs are, it's not ours, right? That's kind of the structure of those arguments. So I actually think that the factual characterization of what's going on in this paper is right. Now, look, there's complicated questions about whether you think a non-person can speak, or whether LLMs are a person, or what a person even is in the first place. But at least as to the question, whose speech is it, assuming it's speech, I think the natural answer is it's the AI model's speech. Now, that paper suggests that, the fact that AI models, a sufficiently capable AI system, could meaningfully speak, meaning it could contribute to the marketplace of ideas and engage in expressive culture and contribute to the culture of democratic self-governance. All those things the First Amendment values. That if an AI system were a speaker in the sense of being able to contribute to that stuff, that we should think of it as a protected speaker, and thus its speech as protected speech. My view is that, while there's some appeal to that argument as a normative matter, that it's just not how the Constitution works. So here's a group of people who contribute to the marketplace of ideas, have a culture of democratic self-governance, engage in a culture of expression, but nevertheless have no First Amendment rights whatsoever. Belgians. Belgians are speakers. Belgians are people. I think we can all agree.
They contribute to the marketplace of ideas, for sure.
They for sure do. They have all kinds of ideas, Belgians. Pommes frites, very good idea. But everybody agrees, including the Supreme Court in a case called Kleindienst versus Mandel, that Belgians themselves have no First Amendment rights. The First Amendment, like most of the Constitution, and especially the individual rights parts of the Constitution, has these kinds of geographic and person relative restrictions or limits. So I think the Constitution is pretty well settled, applies basically in the territorial jurisdiction of the United States, and then probably also to U.S. citizens outside the territorial jurisdiction. It also is pretty well settled that the First Amendment and the other individual constitutional rights apply to humans only. And I say humans here and not persons because there are cases holding that these kinds of rights don't apply to the kinds of animals that maybe some people think are at least person-like. So cases around the rights of great apes not to be experimented on in really, really quite torturous and painful ways. Various courts have held those animals have no Eighth Amendment claims. Elephants have no habeas rights, despite being highly intelligent. So we seem to have at least two kind of clear lines around where the Constitution extends. It's only to kind of human Americans, where American includes both citizens abroad and also non-citizens who happen to be in the territorial jurisdiction of the United States. And like AI just doesn't seem to qualify under, I think, probably either of those prongs. Certainly the human one, right? I think we can all agree whether or not an AI system is a person in some complicated philosophical sense, it's at least not a human person. In the same way that, an elephant is not a human person, even if some people would argue that it's a person in some kind of complicated philosophical sense. And it's not totally clear that AIs are anywhere. They run on server farms. Maybe some copies of GPT-4 run on servers only within, say, California, and in that sense, maybe they're in the United States. But they're not bounded geographically in the same way human beings are. It's totally trivial to move the software running them to Ireland or to Canada or to Belgium or wherever. They don't have to be in one place at the same time. So like network computer systems could have, theoretically a copy of GPT-4 running in every country, simultaneously one part of the system running in like every country in the world at the same time. It's not clear that even thinking about geographic place makes sense for these systems. And so that's why I argue that just as like a pretty boring fact about black letter law, insofar as AI systems are speakers, we should think of them as speakers without First Amendment rights rather than speakers with them. And by the way, that's the default, right? There's it's something like 7 billion people in the world, and only 300 million of them are Americans. All the people are speakers. Only the Americans have First Amendment rights. I talk in the paper about some of the theoretical justifications for why that should be. A lot of them are around the fact that First Amendment rights have benefits but also costs, right? Speech has consequences, including fraud, including defamation, including incitement of violence. And we have a system of laws in the United States that help to balance those benefits and costs. And people who are abroad, who are non-American citizens, who are thus not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States in a meaningful way, are not subject to those laws that balance the benefits and costs. So extending First Amendment protections to them would be in some sense extending a bunch of power without the balancing controls, right? And so that's maybe a kind of sensible thing to say. And indeed, that's what Klein-Dice versus Mendel says about Belgians, what some other cases say about non-human animals, and I think what we should think about AIs. So speakers, albeit not speakers with First Amendment rights.
And so in your paper, you directly refute several different legal scholars that argued that ChatGPT and other large language models are actually worthy of constitutional protections from the whole scope of the Constitution. Would you please elaborate some of the ethical and legal ramifications of granting those rights to artificial intelligence technology?
Yeah, so for sure. So there's this question, like what would it even mean if we thought that something like GPT-4 was entitled to either First Amendment rights or, depending on the reason, maybe other constitutional rights too. So if you have a theory that GPT-4 is entitled to First Amendment rights because it's in some meaningful sense a person, well, then you should probably give it some of the other rights we give people too, right? We think persons are entitled to rights like a right not to be punished cruelly and unusually, a right not to have their life, liberty, and property confiscated without due process of law. And so if you have that kind of robust personhood theory, there are a lot of really hard questions you have to answer before you start extending these rights to AI systems. So, here's a boring one. We think that many persons with constitutional rights have a right to vote. Not all of them, not all elections, but some of them in some elections. How many votes does GPT-4 get? Because GPT-4 is one system, although there are many versions with slight variations, some of them internal to OpenAI, some of them available to the public. And as to each of those versions, there are, some number of copies, right? When we all use GPT-4 in the ChatGPT interface globally, we're not all talking with the same instance of software, right? There are, I don't know how many, hundreds, thousands, millions of copies running simultaneously, talking with people. I don't know, how many votes does GPT-4 get? Seems like a hard question. Suppose that you only extend, let's say First Amendment rights. You want to be a minimalist. You have some other theory. It's not a personhood theory. It's just GPT-4 is a good speaker theory, and so we should give it First Amendment rights. Well, how does it raise a First Amendment claim in court? Okay, maybe it does the same thing you and I do. It gets a lawyer. But suppose it loses its First Amendment suit. Is it res judicata as to all of the instances of GPT-4? Does it matter that some of the instances are slightly different and would contribute to the marketplace of ideas in slightly different ways? I just think there's like a long, long list of questions that are currently unresolved that actually, because like a real practical matter, would need to be answered if we were to start extending constitutional protections to the models themselves, right? These don't really arise if you're thinking about model outputs as user speech, as creator speech. Like, we know how many times I get to sue the government for censoring my speech. It's one time, and then when I lose, it's res judicata, right? But if we think it's the model itself that has some rights, I think there's some like questions that are both very deep, but also like very practically important to answer that we don't have answers to yet.
It's almost like a Pandora's box issue where if you concede that an AI does have First Amendment rights, you have to address an innumerable amount of other legal and philosophical questions.
I think that's right. And look, by the way, I'm not saying that these are not questions we shouldn't try to answer. I mean, I think this is like going to be an interesting area of legal scholarship in the coming years. Look, it depends on how much better you think these models are going to get. But if you think they're going to keep getting better at the pace they have, these are probably questions we should start answering. But as of now, we don't have answers to them.
And so up to this point, we've been discussing and focused on what AI outputs are not, which kind of begs the question, how should AI outputs be treated under the First Amendment? And does the First Amendment even apply to AI outputs at all in your mind?
Okay, good. So this is an important question. And this is somewhere where I actually agree with what I think of as like the weight of the scholarship on this question. There are not that many papers asking these kinds of First Amendment questions about AI systems. The ones that there are, they're mostly short. They're kind of sort of introductory treatments. Many of them say some of the things that I've said I disagree with before, like AI outputs are the creator's speech, AI outputs are the user's speech. AI outputs are corporation speech. We can talk about that one later if you want. Those all seem wrong to me. But what I think is correct is that there is a First Amendment dimension to the regulation of AI outputs. Like, they're not nothing under the First Amendment. It's just that they're not themselves protected speech. Like, protected speech itself is like it's like right at the core of the First Amendment. When the government says like no criticizing the president or something like that, wow, we think that's a regulation that goes right to the core of what the First Amendment forbids. That's a regulation that directly affects protected speech and affects it in a viewpoint, discriminatory way, which is even worse. But the First Amendment protects a whole bunch of stuff that isn't itself protected speech as well. It's actually like kind of a capacious right. It protects, for example, listening, which is not speaking, right? And it protects listening even to unprotected speech, right? So it's just that the listening is not as protected, right? The stuff that's not at the core of the right gets tests that are not as protective of the speech. That is, the government has a freer hand to regulate these things. So I think this model of AI outputs as speech, but as unprotected speech, such that people who have First Amendment rights have a protected interest in listening to them, I think that's actually quite a good model. But when the government wants to regulate that stuff, we generally don't apply a test like strict scrutiny or the Brandenburg test or the Sullivan test, all tests that apply when the government is regulating speech directly. We apply something more deferential. So in the case of listening to unprotected speech, the test actually seems quite deferential, not only in Kleindienst, but in some related cases. The court seems to ask mostly whether the government has some kind of substantial interest and whether that interest is like legitimate, that is like it's not pretextual. And given that, then the regulation's allowed. So it's not like rational basis review, but it's like a reasonability review. So that's one model that I think is a good model, and it's a good model for thinking about a lot of uses of GPT-4 or other language models and their descendants, right? Like when you're having a conversation with them, it's like you're listening or reading a speaker.
So then it sounds like it's regulating the expressive component of me interacting with you right now and me talking to you, and this is my speech, this is your speech, versus my right to listen to you tell me about this topic and formulate my own opinions.
Yes. So yes, my argument is you can separate those two things, that there is an interest I have in talking to you and speaking right now, and there's interest you have in listening to me. Now, I think it's like worth saying that in a lot of cases where the Supreme Court talks about listeners, those two interests are really hard to disentangle, right? Because like I'm in the US right now, you're in the US right now. We both have the right to speak right now. And you might actually think that if, I don't know, like the FBI went around like sticking their fingers in the ears of everyone I tried to talk to, that would not only be an infringement of your right to listen, but also of my right to speak. Like maybe the right to speak also kind of implies a right to listen. Mm-hmm. And so in cases involving both a protected speaker and some protected listeners, I think we actually do see more scrutiny of regulations. But I think those are cases involving both those kinds of rights, the speech and the listening rights. But in like a handful of cases that I try to identify in the paper, where the speaker, the court has ruled, doesn't have an interest in the speech, and it's only the listener that has an interest, we see the test being, I think, substantially more deferential. And I think that's the best way to understand what's going on with AI.
And so to put all that in context, the reason why that's important is because if we say that AI outputs aren't speech and instead they only trigger some sort of interest in protected listening, then the First Amendment threshold and the test applied is much less stringent than if we did consider it speech, and therefore it's not as difficult to regulate some of these problems that you elucidated earlier.
Yeah, under a test like that, I'm much less worried that if the federal or state government tells OpenAI, you can't release GPT-6 because we got it to try and help us make cyanide, that I'm much less worried that that OpenAI can win a suit by saying this law is not well tailored because cyanide's not that poisonous, right? Mm-hmm. It gives the government a freer hand to really demand that these things are provably safe rather than the government having to robustly prove that they're quite unsafe before demanding more engineering work or delay in release.
So does that go more towards the nascent state of AI right now? And so if it develops into GPT-7, where it can say a whole bunch of, if it could tell me how to steal the nuclear launch codes, for example, a government regulation would apply and say, hey, look, we have a national security interest in preventing this from occurring. And so it gives the government a substantially lower burden of proof to justify that regulation?
Yes, absolutely. So I want to be clear. I don't think that any AI system that exists now, probably even including Claude 3, which was released yesterday. I mean, it's early days, but like it seems pretty reasonably safe. I don't think any of these systems do pose these kinds of large-scale threats. I just think that the things they can do now show us that if they continue to get good in the same ways they've been getting good, at the same rate they've been getting good, that they might be able to do these things in the future. And so to take your example of the nuclear launch codes, it seems really important that we be really sure that GPT-7 can't somehow get a hold of the nuclear launch codes. And it seems really important that we do that before GPT-7 gets released, right? Because it's well and good to, regulate the person who asks GPT-7 to help them, hack their neighbor's Bitcoin account to steal their Bitcoins. Okay, that's a problem we can deal with ex post. We can impose criminal and tort liability. We might think that's a good deterrent. But for risks like these, risks that, you said nuclear launch codes, you can take that one, or even something like, I was able to obtain a live sample of Spanish flu or something like that. and release it. You can't remedy those harms once they happen. They're too large scale. You can't bring back the dead friends and relatives. You can't, I mean, even if you only cared about the property damage, the monetary harm, for large scale stuff like biorisk, for large scale stuff like big cyber attacks, for large scale stuff like, God forbid, if there were some way that an AI system aided a rogue state in some kind of false flag operation that triggered a nuclear launch by the United States, like, you can't fix that on the back end.
So we're keeping the lid on top of Pandora's box.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what is the other method you said you proposed to protect AI outputs with?
Yeah, so one model is to think of them as speakers, but speakers without First Amendment rights. The other model, I think, fits better this other kind of use case that I mentioned before, where AIs, large language models, and probably other kinds too, can be really useful brainstorming tools. They can help you improve your grammar, your sentence structure. They can critique the essays you've written, help you make them better. And so, insofar as regulations impede those uses of AI systems, I think the best way to understand those regulations is like as regulations not of speech itself, but as tools for producing speech. And we have a bunch of precedents about that. So like camping is not itself speaking, but sometimes people want to speak by camping. They want to camp on the National Mall to protest DC's treatment of homeless people. And so the regulation is aimed at something that's useful to producing speech. It's a tool for speaking. But it's not a regulation that is sort of affecting the speech directly. It's not saying, look, you can't say that DC's treating homeless people badly. Like, you can say that. The question is just whether you can say it using a campsite on the National Mall. Similarly, you might say, look, insofar as this rule prevents you from using an AI to spell check your essay about a fictional, terrorist attack you're inventing, look, it's not telling you can't write that essay. It's just the regulation's not preventing you from writing that essay. It's just preventing you from using a certain kind of tool to craft and perfect it. And so laws like that we usually call either incidental burdens on speech or time, place, and manner restrictions. And we have like a nice, neat test called intermediate scrutiny for evaluating those. It likewise, it has some teeth, but it is not nearly as demanding as the kinds of tests that apply when we see the government regulating speech directly. So for those kinds of uses of AI systems, I think understanding AI as a tool for speaking is a good model, and it's a model that the First Amendment tells us how we should treat it.
And so you touched on this a little bit earlier, talking about corporations and corporate speech. So it's a sort of logical extension of the idea that AI outputs are not protected speech. You also address the issue in your paper of whether they could be considered corporate speech. Would you mind telling us a little bit more about that?
Yes, that's kind of the fourth and final leading theory. Corporations have, or I don't want to quite say corporations have speech rights in the United States. Corporations can bring speech claims in the United States. Whether that's the same as having speech rights depends on what you think it means to have a right. But the structure of corporate First Amendment claims is actually pretty clear. It's even clear in a case like Citizens United, which I think is broadly understood as being a pretty stridently pro-corporate speech case, in a way that people really objected to at the time it was decided, and I think still today. So in Citizens United, when Supreme Court explains why corporations can bring First Amendment claims, they say something like this. Well, look, people have First Amendment rights. They speak, and if they're censored, they can bring claims. And so do groups of people. If you and I co-author an essay and it's censored, we can bring a claim. And a corporation is just a kind of collection of people. It's a collection of owners and employees and maybe contractors too. And it would be super weird if we said that other kinds of people or collections of people could bring speech claims, but as soon as they call their collection a corporation, they're no longer able to bring those claims. And the reason it's super weird, maybe it wouldn't even be super weird absent this, but one reason it's super weird is that unlike other kinds of collections, my softball club or something like that, corporations can be sued. So the government can sue the New York Times in, say, the Pentagon Papers case and get an injunction from a federal court that enjoins the New York Times from printing a story about the leaked papers on the origins of the Vietnam War. And it would be really weird if, at the moment where the New York Times journalist is, or let's say it's an independent journalist who's going to then contract with the New York Times, the independent journalist writes the story about the Pentagon Papers. That's protected speech. That's a human being with rights. But as soon as that speech gets handed off to a corporation, the New York Times, if it then lost its First Amendment protection, which would lose if the New York Times could itself be enjoined from printing it. That's as bad as it's as bad to throw the New York Times copies in the ocean as it is to throw the copies I print at my house in the ocean. That would be a weird way of stripping the human beings who have First Amendment rights of their First Amendment rights as soon as their speech kind of touched a corporation. The government can sue the corporation and join the speech that way. And so the Citizens United Court says, well, of course, to prevent that, we have to treat corporations as being able to bring First Amendment claims. Because they can be sued, they have to be able to raise the defenses that would apply to the people who own them, who contract with them, who work for them. And that seems basically right to me. You can argue about how far that should extend. In fact, that's, I think, a lot of the arguments over corporate speech are not over that basic question. I think everybody agrees that the New York Times should be able to bring First Amendment claims on behalf of basically its journalists when they make an allegedly defamatory statement in an article. Where people disagree is just whether it should extend indefinitely, right? Corporations can spend a lot of money, so it's not just that they can transmit something a single person says, but they can transmit it a lot. They can buy all the airtime during the Super Bowl if they're, Apple or something, someone really rich. And so some people say, look, not that much corporate speech, but everyone I think agrees with this basic story that this is a reason we need at least some corporate speech. But the structure of that reason is that corporations preserve the rights of the people who had them in the first place. But they don't generate additional speech rights or additional speech claims. It's corporate speech rights are there to keep human beings with constitutional rights from losing the ability to assert those rights when they touch a corporation. But there's then no reason to think that corporations should be able to assert First Amendment claims in situations where no human being could. And that's what we would be saying if we said that the outputs of GPT-4 were OpenAI's protected speech, because they're not the engineers who made GPT-4's speech, because they're not any OpenAI user's speech, because maybe they're GPT-4's speech, but GPT-4 can't raise First Amendment claims. There's no First Amendment claim that we lose if we...
Sorry, is that because it doesn't represent the group of people that comprise it, as with Citizens United, where if corporations represent the views of the people that make up them, if AI doesn't fundamentally represent anybody, it just computes out an answer, then that would make sense.
Well, yeah, it's so OpenAI can assert the claims of the people who are associated with it, who work for it or whatever. But there just is no claim that any of those human beings can raise about the outputs of GPT-4. GPT-4 is not some engineer's speech. It's not some user's speech. It's not the protected speech, at least, of GPT-4 itself. So there's no reason to then turn and say, but nevertheless, it is OpenAI's speech. There's no First Amendment claim that we need to preserve in this way. And so, in my view, the argument against AI outputs as corporate speech is just a natural consequence of the arguments that it's not user speech, creator speech, or the protected speech of the AI itself.
And so, at risk of oversimplifying what we've covered up to this point, it sounds like the key takeaway here is that we haven't necessarily discovered a new protected speaker, but rather we've merely created a new dimension to our own First Amendment rights, whether as protected listening or as a tool, both that trigger a more modest form of First Amendment protections.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think one thing that the paper is trying to show is that even though generative AI systems are like a radically new kind of technology, and I think will make radical changes in the world in many ways, at least our First Amendment doctrine actually seems already pretty well suited to deal with them. We actually have like buckets into which this stuff fits. Like we have a set of doctrines for dealing with the speech of people who are not part of the community of First Amendment rights holders. And we have a set of doctrines that are useful for understanding how government can and can't regulate the tools people enjoy using as they produce and transmit speech. And so the argument is actually like, hey, like, congratulations, the American legal system. You are ahead of the curve, at least on this one issue. You have the tools you need to deal with AI outputs and the efforts to regulate them, to make them safe for humans.
Thank you, Professor. It's been wonderful to learn about this with you.
Yeah.
You are such a legal pioneer. I can't wait to see what you do in the future with AI.
Well, that's very kind of you. Thank you so much for having me. This has been really fun.
Thank you again, Professor.
Thanks for listening. Emphasis Added is a podcast brought to you by the Houston Law Review. If you like what you see, check us out on Spotify, YouTube, or your favorite podcast streaming app for new content when it drops.
Follow us on Instagram at Emphasis Added Pod, or check out the Law Review at HoustonLawReview.org.